Everyone. Thank you all for coming to our second weekly Auk Talk speaker event. I'm Dawson Wainman. I'm the Director of Student Life for the Frost Student Association. Co-hosting with me tonight is Adam Folland, the President of the Frost Student Association. And of course, we're joined by Fleming Frost's very own Josh Feltham. Josh is here tonight to talk with us about his talk, Expedition Ectotherm, Adventures with Amphibians and Reptiles in Ontario. Thank you for being here, Josh, and please take it away.
All right, you're welcome. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you here. Recognize some names on this list. And oh, there's Katrina as well. So good to see everybody here. I'm going to share my screen here and start the presentation shortly. The way I like to work through things this evening is to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to ask questions. And I think the easiest way to do that is for you to post your questions to the chat, and we will work to answer them as they come up, so that that we don't leave them all to the end. Okay, so let's try to keep this a little bit more interactive, shall we say. Oh, can everybody see this screen now with a couple of photographs? Yes, all right, let's see now. We have on in this image, just to give you some background for those of you who don't know me, I teach in the ecosystem management program and the conservation biology program here at the college. And for most of my life, I guess they say in order to become an expert in anything, you need to spend about 10,000 hours doing whatever it is that you're going to become an expert in. And I'm not sure whether I'd consider myself an expert, but I've certainly spent my 10,000 hours since about the age of 8 out observing and mucking around with amphibians and reptiles for most of my life. And I still am putting in lots and lots of hours because that's absolutely what I love to do. So as far as my passion, it is being outdoors and working with amphibians and reptiles. And that passion has taken me throughout Eastern North America and Inter-Central America and South America, and had a little bit of experience in South Africa. Although the primary purpose of that visit was not to muck around with amphibians and reptiles. But you can be sure, no matter where I am, that that's what I'm looking for, provided that the conditions are suitable. Of course, right here in Ontario, we are not in ideal conditions right now, but within a few weeks, we will be in a situation where many of you will be able to go out and start to observe the first activity of some of our amphibians in Ontario. The picture on the left is a photograph of me taking a photograph. Does anybody know what I'm photographing? A five-line skink, that's correct. So we have a female five-line skink, and she is sitting on a rock around an old fire pit. I spent, well, 8 years of my life studying five-line skinks as part of my PhD thesis, and I continue to work with these lizards in Ontario to this day, and I'm getting ready for some more work this spring. On the right-hand side, of course, I've got some fun and, I should say, maybe not so friendly, but or maybe just not happy animal there in my hands, the snapping turtle, our largest turtle species in the province. So this evening, what I want to do is share with you some information about amphibians and reptiles in Ontario, some stories about some of the experiences that I've had, and some things about amphibians and reptiles that you may not appreciate as much, to try to get you to think about the animals you see every day. And we have some pretty amazing amphibians and reptiles in Ontario. And to tell you the truth, a lot of those really amazing amphibians and reptiles that we have are not the really rare ones. They're actually very common and abundant. So our theme tonight, and those of you who've been out in the field with me know this, but our theme tonight is, it's not just all right. And what I mean by that is, quite often when we see something that we see every day and somebody asks us, hey, what are you looking at? Oh, it's just a skink, or it's just a snapping turtle, or it's just a robin. We're not allowed to say that. because if we devalue these things that we see every day, then those things are bound to become rare, right? If we only value the rare things and we only do something about it when they become rare. So we're not allowed to say it's just when we're out in the field. Any questions? As I said, feel free to get started. With respect to amphibians and reptiles, I want to talk about, first of all, their overall importance. Hopefully you're here because obviously you have some interest in amphibians and reptiles, and looking at the list of people that are attending here, I know that some of you have taken the courses that I offer about amphibians and reptiles, so your knowledge level is going to be pretty good, I expect. But we, first of all, from our perspective as people who are in the environmental industry and sort of driven towards environmental issues, we can easily see the importance of these species ecologically. And so we have an image here of a very abundant species of salamander in eastern North America. Who can tell me what species of salamander this is? All right, we got Talia, Natasha, Amanda, and I heard someone chime in there. Redback salamander is correct. And this is a really interesting beast for a whole host of reasons, but we don't have all night. We could talk about all of these things at length. But what I want to talk about with the redback salamander ecologically is that this salamander is one of the most abundant vertebrates in the eastern forests in North America. So the way that this is assessed is they look at the biomass of the salamander, and the biomass is essentially the living weight, all right, the weight of living organisms, all right. And when you look at the biomass of the redback salamander, its biomass is greater than the biomass of all the breeding birds in that same forest during peak breeding season. Imagine how many tiny redback salamanders it takes for that to happen. And the study that found that result may have actually underestimated the biomass of the salamanders based on new data by 10 times. So the biomass may actually be 10 times more than what we realize. Cooper mentions that he sees redback salamanders as a kid. They are charming little guys, absolutely. Talia agrees. They are neat and very abundant, and pretty much to find these salamanders, if you've got a decent patch of deciduous or mixed forest, they tend to be under the cover, such as logs and vegetation. All right. So as far as the redback salamanders, they are a small species, Dawson, so they should be smaller than the blue spotted in general. Blue spotteds are much larger and more robust species. So as far as ecology goes, these are important animals because if you think of biomass, what does that represent really in an ecosystem? From an ecological perspective, what does biomass represent other than the weight of living organisms? Yeah, it's food, right? Nutrients, energy, right? And if this species makes up that significant portion of nutrients and energy available in that ecosystem, that's a pretty critical thing for that ecosystem. So ecologically, we agree they're really important. However, when you're out there doing your work, you'll run into people, and when you're at home, maybe at a family gathering, there might be those folks in your family that wonder, what are you doing? Getting into the environmental industry. It doesn't make much money. It's not a whole lot of fun. You got to be outdoors all the time. Why do you think these things are important? So for some of those folks, you need to think about the economic value of these species. Now, before we do that, what species of snake do we have in this image? Get some ID skills going here. Eastern fox snake from Dermot, from Adam, from Amanda, and Natasha. Exactly, Eastern fox snake. And so the eastern fox snake is one of our largest species of snake in Ontario. They can attain a length of almost 1.5 meters. And this species, of course, when we look at reptiles, one of the first things that people think about in terms of economic benefit, what's the economic benefit associated with an eastern fox snake, do you think? Eating rodents, Wesley says, absolutely. All right, so essentially pest species, pest control, right? So they reduce the numbers of pests. And actually, recent work over an 11-year study down in Windsor, where they were tracking fox snakes on a regular basis, found that the fox snakes essentially they'll find a nest of rodents. They'll go in there and eat pretty much every one they can. So they catch the adults first and then eat all the little babies, and they hang around there with a full belly until they've digested. And then the snake looks for another nest and eats another nest. And they just spend all summer eating nests of rodents. And in particular, this study took place in more of an urban setting in Windsor. And so they're finding that in this area, where obviously there are lots of rodents, these snakes are probably a very important element in terms of controlling those pests. So pest control is important. You might think of that in terms of agriculture and the damage that they do in agriculture. But also in a domestic setting, we have issues as well. First of all, with property damage, right? We can have those rodents getting into your house and they're chewing on wires. And so we have property damage that they are helping to deal with. Okay. And of course, that property damage can also result in things such as fire. All right. So pest control, agricultural situation, domestic situations too, in urban areas. If we think about another situation, what else does the pest control help with? Yeah, disease control. Exactly. Hey, James, good to see you here. And Amanda, all right. Yeah, disease. All right. So they're helping to control disease. Now, is there a cost associated with disease? Absolutely. All right. If we think about the costs associated with medical people getting medical attention, we say free Medicare, but it's provided by the government. And who's the government? That's us. We're paying for it. And so if we can manage diseases, then that is a really helpful thing as well. So reptiles, for example, they don't get rabies. And so that's an issue. And a lot of diseases, especially certain mice, can spread hantavirus, for example, white-footed mice in particular, and they can be common in urban areas. And if these snakes are eating them, they're helping to control those diseases. So for those who are asking you about why this is important, you now have some information about economic value of these species uh, as a weapon to engage in your meaningful conversations and maybe change some minds. We also think about society and social issues. So somebody you may talk to may not be driven by economic issues or ecology, but maybe they're thinking about social issues and they're thinking about the welfare of people out there in general. And again, when we think about social issues and we think about social institutions like our hospitals, there are all kinds of things with respect to hospitals and healthcare that amphibians and reptiles play an important role for. What kind of frog do we have here in this image? Wood frog. Yeah, this is the most widespread frog species in North America and one of the, if not the only amphibian that actually has a distribution that goes above the Arctic Circle. And one of the key things about this frog is the fact that it is freeze tolerant. And so it can actually freeze. And the way that it freezes and maintains healthy tissue is something that is being studied and can be used for maintaining living tissue in a frozen state. We haven't been able to do it yet, but this frog species and several other freeze-tolerant species are being studied for that purpose. And of course, that can help you with transplants of organs, right? So that's going to help include people and help people potentially live longer. Now, there are some other really interesting things to think about with respect to hospitals and healthcare. Anybody heard of a situation where somebody went to the hospital for one thing and then they got an infection while they were in the hospital? Yeah, staph, right, staph infection. And what do we know about some of the staph strains that are in hospitals? Shelby and Talia mentioned that. So good idea on it from Amanda and Dermot and Jessica. Yeah, so they're antibiotic resistant strains of this. And of course, if we think of amphibians, they've got this really permeable skin. And we think they're really sensitive to things, and of course they are, but they produce all these antifungal and antibacterial and antimicrobial agents in their mucus that they secrete over their skin to help protect them from the biotics, or to help to protect them from the fungus and the viruses that are in the environments that they live. And so some of these compounds, these antibiotics, these antifungal compounds that are in the mucus of the frogs are actually being studied, and they will be effective against these antibiotic resistant strains. So think about that in terms of our protection and healthcare as well. So in terms of the social benefit of these species, really important as well. So we've got some more things there. Any questions about that? Good. You guys are pretty knowledgeable about all this stuff. So moving on, last thing to culture. These animals do have a cultural importance. First of all, if we think of many of our indigenous peoples, they certainly have a cultural significance there. You know, many of our First Nations refer to North America as Turtle Island. Adam mentions here, can that be quantified in price point that you know of? Well, in terms of the price point, Adam, it could be quantified absolutely, both the social issues and the economic issues, because you can look at the number of people that are infected by the antibiotic resistant strains. You could look at the cost it takes to treat those people. You could look at loss of time for those people, you know, in terms of how long they have to be in the hospital. So yes, it can all be quantified. I don't know that it has been, but it certainly can be. The data would be there for sure. Good question. Any other questions before I move on? All right, so as I said, there are the cultural values we think of again with indigenous peoples for sure. And there are also, you know, in terms of our cultural values, where people are shifting their culture, their values towards the outdoors and biodiversity and preserving biodiversity and recognizing that's bio, not bid diversity, um, and recognizing that biodiversity and our connection to it and our ability to be able to spend time and interact with it has a huge value in terms of our culture and of course our well-being as well. So think about that when you're being questioned about your passion or interest in these things or anything that you're looking at. Think about different ways that you can approach that topic in a way to relate to the people that you're talking to. All right, and so this is just an example of the ecological, economic, social, and cultural value of amphibians and reptiles. Now, let's do a little bit of a quiz here. Those of you who've taken my courses know I like to do these. Can we list these taxonomic groups in order of the number of species from greatest to the least? So we have our frogs represented and toads. So this is the order Anura, frogs and toads. And then we have the order Caudata, which are salamanders and newts. And then we have the order Testudines, which are the turtles and tortoises. And then we have suborder Sauria, which is within the order Squamata. And then we have the suborder Serpentes for the snakes, which are both in the order Squamata. So who is going to get us started on which order has or which group has the greatest number of species, do you think? Okay, the redback salamander biomass, greater than breeding bird. I guess Caudata is number one. Shelby's saying Caudata is number one. So we're looking at not the number of individuals, but the number of species. So Shelby's got to vote for Caudata as number one. Who else is in there for Caudata? Okay, someone else hopping in. So Vanessa and Natasha are hopping in there. Cooper's going with Anura. Okay. We have two more in here. And some more Anura. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3. And then we have Squamatinator from Julian. All right, he's saying one in there. A couple more for Anura. All right, the frogs and toads are running away with it. All right, Dermot says Anura. I'm new, but I'm excited to have a new fun fact in my belt. Awesome, Dawson. That's a good way to go. Same here. Okay, so shall we do the big reveal? All right, here we go. So Onura's pretty good. You're pretty good. It's the second most diverse in terms of species. So in Ontario, we have 12 species of frogs and toads in Ontario. However, the squamata, in terms of the snakes, run away with it, with 15 species of snakes in the province. All right, followed by, so we have the snakes are number one, and then we have our frogs and toads number two, our salamanders number three, and turtles four, and our one lizard number five. All right, so that's our diversity. What I'm going to do this evening is I want to give you a representation or example of a member of each of these groups that you can find within, well, really, for the most part, within an hour of where we are, and actually a lot of them right on campus and on property owned by the college. And I want to talk about these animals, as I said, keeping with the theme of not just and these animals are common and abundant, and hopefully they'll teach you something about them that next time you see one of them, you'll be thinking a little bit more about what you're looking at and the amazing things that they have to share with us. And we're going to start our story off with salamanders. All right, how many of you have seen more than one species of salamander in Ontario? If you've seen salamanders, probably you've seen a redback. But have anybody seen more than one species of salamander in Ontario? Yep, Dermot says yes. Jess says yes. James says yes. Vanessa, yeah, yeah. So how many have seen more than three species? Okay, Wesley has yes, and Adam has. Excellent. Okay, but not as many. All right, so it gets a little bit more challenging. Well, let's see if we can identify these salamanders in this image, these images, first of all. So let's go to the one on the bottom right. This salamander looks kind of like a redback salamander. It's in the same family. These are lungless salamanders. That's pretty cool. They breathe entirely through their skin. Kind of like a four-toed, Amanda, but the four-toed, yeah, it is a little different in the pattern on the side. Connor has two-lined, Wesley says two-lined, and John says two-lined or two-striped. You're correct. This is a two-lined salamander. And so the difference we have here in terms of the two-lined versus the four-toed, first of all, these two dark lines along the side, that's important. But if you look at the tail here, the four-toed salamander has a tail that's rounded, not laterally compressed. See, this tail's kind of flat on the sides. That's because this salamander spends a fair bit of time in streams. The other thing about the two-lined salamander tail is that it's other than being round, at the very base of the tail, there's like a little indentation or a constriction there, because that's a special break point on a four-toed salamander, but not on a two-lined. So yeah, good work there, two-line salamander. And up above, what species do we potentially have here? Okay, blue spotted is a potential. Jefferson is another potential. Sean says Jefferson. Vanessa says Jefferson. So Jefferson, blue spotted mole salamander for Wesley. So the big difference here in terms of the Jefferson versus the blue spotted, the Jefferson has longer toes like this one. This one has pretty long toes. The blue spots are restricted. If they're present, they're on the side and the legs. The blue spotted salamander will have lots of blue spots on the top of the body and on the head as well. Okay, so the length of the toes and the limbs and the restriction of the blue spots on the side indicates this is more likely a Jefferson's. Although, what would we have to do to determine it's a Jefferson's 100%? There's two things that could tell us it's a Jefferson's. Okay, DNA test, exactly, because there's this weird group of salamanders we're going to talk about a little later. But there's another way to tell it's a Jefferson's. If it were, this is a female, so this one we'd have to do a DNA test. Leg size can help, Sean, absolutely, but not absolute. Dermot, location, and Cheryl, yeah, location of where they are is definitely helpful if we're outside of Jefferson's territory. But let's say we're in Jefferson's territory. Wesley says sex it. Yep, if it's a male, it's a Jefferson's. All right, because this other thing that you could confuse it for. All right, if it's a male, it's a Jefferson's, because the other one is on all female lineage that would look similar to it. Okay. All right, and over here we've got some eggs. These eggs here are from a spotted salamander, Ambystum immaculatum. And these eggs here are from this weird group that we call unisexuals that we're going to talk about in just a moment. All right, and the way we can tell the difference is by looking at how much of this gelatinous coat there is around the eggs. The spotted salamander eggs are really thick, kind of like a firm jello, whereas the unisexuals and the blue spotteds and the Jefferson salamander eggs, they have a very thin gelatinous coat and they're more soft, like gel that hasn't been set yet. All right, cool. So some good ID there. Good work, folks. Thanks for all your participation and contribution. I really appreciate that. All right, so one thing I want to talk about here is the spotted salamanders. This is a species that we can find throughout Ontario. How many of you have seen a spotted salamander? Yep. Okay, good. A few people, Sean and Dermot. These are some of the most abundant salamanders in eastern North America, not as abundant as the redback, but very abundant. The trick is they are called mole salamanders, and they spend most of their time underground. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about these salamanders and their breeding. And they breed in very large numbers, but over a short period of time, when conditions are generally not conditions that most people consider favorable. Do you know when the best time to go out and see these salamanders is? In the rain, yep, absolutely. Rain, and there's generally still snow on the ground, yeah. So that means it's cold. So how many of you love to go out on cold, rainy nights? Just before sunrise, after sunset? Yeah, actually, it's best to go after sunset for these guys for sure. Around any time between 9 and sometime in around midnight is a good time. Early in the spring that these salamanders will start going. If there's been lots of rain and the ground becomes saturated, Dawson, then you're looking on cold, rainy nights anywhere from 1-2 degrees Celsius and up, and rainy. Or if there's just been a lot of rain during the day, then you'll be able to head out there. But you want to look at the snow. Right now we've got too much snow. You're going to have some areas that are exposed because these salamanders will be underground in the burrows of rodents. And underground in cavities. And so there has to be areas that are exposed. But if you hit it at the right time, you can see them emerging from those underground burrows, and they'll walk across the ground, they'll walk across ice and snow to make their way to the ponds where they breed. And in those ponds, if you hit it right, you could see anywhere from 5 or 10 to 100 to 200 of these salamanders doing their thing in that pond and breeding. One of the ways you can figure out, yeah, it's pretty impressive, Talia, for sure. If you hit the right night, and it usually happens over the course of a week or two, that the breeding will be happening. And what you can do, if you think a pond might have these salamanders and they might be active, when you go to that pond, one of the things that these salamanders do, this species in particular, is that the males deposit something called a spermatophore. So if you have a log or a piece of wood or a leaf in the pond, the male deposits a packet of sperm on that log or stick, and it's white. So if you go to a pond where these salamanders are breeding, you'll find all these little white fuzzy things. They're about half the size of a pea. They're just tiny little white fuzzy objects. Look almost like a little bit of fungus growing on the stick. And if you see a lot of those during the day, then I'd suggest you head back there at nighttime to check out the salamanders, because the males will go into the pond and they'll deposit these spermatophores, and they'll deposit spermatophores before the female gets there. So Cooper, you know of these things, but what species are you familiar with them from? Spiders, yeah. Okay, for Wesley, for spiders, Dermot, happens there's a warm spell and they come out and then the weather drops to sub-zero again. Well, Dermot, it's not too much of a problem for them if they're in the pond, because the pond is probably not going to freeze and their oxygen requirements are pretty low. but that's a normal thing that happens. Temperatures fluctuate, and the salamanders seem to know when to get in and out and to be able to deal with those conditions. It's amazing how nature sorts itself out. All right, so look for those spermatophores if you're around ponds you think the salamanders might be in during the day, and then head back to those ponds again at nighttime. And again, looking for that cold, rainy weather. I'd expect this year, depending on how things go, the salamanders will probably be up and running around in this part of the province, running around, maybe wandering about in within the next probably 3 to 5 weeks, depending on what the conditions are like over the month of March. So we can find them sometimes as early as the end of March or early April in Ontario. And certainly down in southwestern Ontario, extreme southwestern Ontario, the mole salamanders are already starting to move around in some areas. John asks if they're in still water only. Yes, these salamanders will breed in still water and generally in water that does not include any fish. Okay, so they breed in what we call vernal or ephemeral ponds that are typically in wooded areas. All right, good questions. All right, so just to talk a little bit more about these salamanders. So here's a photograph of our blue-spotted salamander. Chances are, if you're in Ontario and you're outside of Jefferson salamander range, you're likely, if you find a salamander that might look like a blue spot, like this one here, you're probably looking at a unisexual. And we'll talk about what the unisexuals are. But this unisexual here is a blue spot dependent, and we'll talk about what that means. Blue spotted dependent unisexual. And this was photographed at Ken Reed Conservation Area, just outside of town. You can walk there from town if you wanted to get a little bit of exercise. All right, and this, of course, is a pure blue spot. It is a male, and so that's a blue-spotted salamander. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit of a story about these amazing salamanders that are found throughout the province that you can see. So what happened here, we start our story about 2.5 million years ago. Okay, and about 2.5 million years ago, two species, we'll just call them species A and species B, they hybridized. All right, and when you get two species that hybridize, in amphibians and reptiles, what happens when two species hybridize and they produce an offspring is they often produce a very curious creature. Right, the hybrid often ends up, and in most cases that we know of unisexual snakes, lizards, salamanders, and other unisexual reptiles, primarily unisexual lizards that we know this from, but it also in the salamanders, they are the result of a hybridization event. So about 2.5 million years ago, species A and B got amorous and they produced this unisexual. All right, and that was the result of the union of species A and species B. Okay, following along so far? All right, now what happened was that actually species B ended up, as environmental conditions changed, the distribution of species B doesn't overlap with species A or the unisexual. We'll just call it the uni here. But the unisexual is a little interesting. What usually happens with unisexuals? And this, how are unisexuals, how do they reproduce? So far, so good. Everything. Sexual parasite. Wesley knows about these things. Yeah, so this is a sexual parasite. Not all unisexuals are like that. For lizards, for example, in the cases of unisexual lizards, a female produces more females that are just clones of herself, and she doesn't need a male at all. No male required. Okay, of any kind. However, these unisexuals, remember I said that the unisexual in the photograph was a blue spotted dependent. All right, so our unisexual needs to have the sperm from one of the sexual pure species in order to be able to reproduce. Okay, Now, in that case, sometimes the genetic information that she has that is donated through the sperm is incorporated, and sometimes it's not. So, how many sets of chromosomes do animals typically have with vertebrates? How many sets is the typical number of chromosomes? Two. So, we'll say that this unisexual is 2N, and this individual is 2N. Okay. So now we will look through here and what they produce. All right, as I said, the unisexual A, or the pure species A, is donating to our unisexual, and our unisexual is producing offspring, and the offspring can be 2N, just like the female, but sometimes the genetic information of the male is incorporated and they become 3N. This is one of the most common forms that we find in Ontario. So if you're in an area where blue spotteds occur outside of where the Jeffersons occur, especially in southern Ontario, you're probably looking at not a pure blue spotted, but a unisexual that has 3 sets of chromosomes. All right, we call that a triploid. Okay. And those 3 sets of chromosomes can be from 3 different species, because these unisexuals don't just interact with that original species A. These unisexuals will interact with species A, B, I'm not going to write yellow on the yellow, C, or D, and they can interact with any of those species in terms of the male and reproduce. Spencer asked a question, does that change the phenotype? Yes, it does change the phenotype. So if, for example, we have a unisexual that has combined with A, it's going to be an intermediate between the unisexual and A. So for example, if A is the blue spotted, then it's going to look an awful lot like a blue spotted. If B, for example, is Jefferson's, then it's going to look a little bit more like a Jefferson's. If C, the other species that it integrates with, is a tiger salamander, which we don't have in Ontario, but we also have smallmouth salamanders. So we have this this beast, depending on where it is, interacting with any one of these 4 species, and the phenotype, in terms of what it looks like, will be an in-between state of the different species. And the other thing to note is that we can have, so I said 2N is relatively common. The most common is 3N. And we also have 4N individuals and, 4N. And we have even had cases where they have individuals that have 5N, or 5 sets of chromosomes. And they can be from multiple species. So this individual here, this 4N individual, could actually have genetic information from 3 different species. Pretty cool stuff. So Adam, you are correct. The genotype is definitely different, but the genotype is influencing the phenotype of what they look like. Okay. Any questions about that crazy stuff? As I said, these are just right here in our backyard, 10 minutes out of town, and you can find this kind of thing going on. All right. Well, so they're also an asexually reproducing lizard that needs sexual stimulation to begin reproduction. Somewhat, but not always. Yeah. Yeah, so there are some asexual species, Wesley, where the females will actually engage in sort of pseudo-copulatory behavior, and it is shown that that behavior helps to induce ovulation in the female that has not bred yet. And the female that sort of assumes the male role is a female that has actually already ovulated and produced eggs. So it's interesting to note that there are some differences there in terms of which female assumes which role in that pseudo-copulation. Yeah, lots of cool stuff for sure. Not in Ontario, but in the US, those species occur there. All right, so let's look at some frogs now, and just to trying to keep things moving along. Hopefully this is of interest to you and nobody's fallen asleep, but so far lots of good engagement. We have 5 species actually in these photographs. So anybody want to take a crack at identification first? Thanks, Cooper. So we're going to take a crack. So let's go with bottom left-hand corner. What species do we have in the bottom left-hand corner? Green frog, bottom left, Dermot. That's correct. It's got this dorsolateral fold that runs down the body and around the tympanum. All right, Fowler's toad, American toad, green frog, spring. Okay, so where's the Fowler's toad, Wesley? No, not on the bottom right. This is a Fowler's toad here, actually. White belly, small tubercles on the back. It's hard to see, but an oval parotid gland. So this is a Fowler's toad. This one here is actually not a toad. Yeah, Adam, this is the gray tree frog, um, in the bottom right. And that's this white spot under the eyes is a key thing. And we note that there isn't a parotid gland. So there's no big gland here behind the eye. That's another key thing that's different between the gray tree frog and the Fowler's toad. Both of them do have a white belly though. And up in the top right, of course, we have our American toad, and then peeping along here, we have our spring peeper. So those are some of our frog species in Ontario, one of which is pretty rare, that's the Fowler's toad, but the other species are very widespread and common throughout the province. And so you can guess that I'm going to talk about one of them. Little quick question here. We already talked about the gray tree frog. What do you remember about the gray tree frog in terms of what it can deal with? Yeah, freeze tolerant. And so we have freeze tolerance and freeze resistance. So freeze tolerant means that they actually freeze. Freeze resistance means that they actually can resist it. So they can have something called super cooling. And so they use particular compounds that prevent freezing from happening. And so the gray tree frog is freeze resistant while the wood frog is freeze tolerant. And so those are different forms of dealing with the same issue. And these species don't remain frozen all winter. It's important to note that in the places where they are, generally the temperature is not below freezing when they're down there in that leaf litter and covered by the snow. But if that snow layer gets thin and they're exposed, they can tolerate being frozen at temperatures of -6 to -7 or 8 degrees Celsius for a week or so. And so they are freeze tolerant species. A species I want to talk about though is the gray tree frog. How many of you have seen a gray tree frog before? All right, so yes, we've seen them. Yep, they're very abundant. Dawson has yet to see one. They are right on campus, Dawson. So this spring, as temperatures warm up, if you're familiar with the campus, if you head back towards the um, heavy equipment field, if you're on the southeast side, there's a pond on the southeast side of the heavy equipment field. And yeah, so Jess saw one in the community garden. Shelby Dawson's familiar with the campus. Yeah, absolutely. So head back there and you can see these salamanders. Now, the trick is with these salamanders or so with these frogs is timing. So those of you who've taken the amphibian course might remember this, but what's one of the things that this frog is going to wait for before it starts to call? We know the salamanders need the ground to be saturated so they get up out of their burrows and wander around. What's this frog waiting for? Any idea? Other than some rain. No, not leaf growth. Temperature. Yes, Spencer, that's correct. Temperature. And yeah, depending on the temperature, there is some sort of debate and variation in the temperatures. But in most places, once it's more than 13 degrees Celsius, so if it's 14 degrees Celsius at nighttime, these frogs will be calling. Once it drops below 14, the chances of them calling are minimal. The lowest temperature they've been recorded to be calling in Ontario is 8 degrees Celsius. Okay, so if you are going to go out and listen for these frogs, head out and make sure that it's at least 8 degrees and preferably over 14 degrees Celsius at nighttime. Versatemperature instead of versicolor. Yeah, versicolor, of course, comes from the fact that they have variable color. And that is something to note that one frog will change color depending on its temperature. When they're warmer, they tend to be lighter in color than when they are cool. So they will change color in a relatively short time. Yeah, like mushrooms can change as well over time. So that's the gray tree frog. Another thing about this frog that's quite unique, there is a type of gray tree frog that's called Cope's gray tree frog, and it occurs in the southeastern US. And this is another case here of hybridization. And the gray tree frog is actually a result of a hybridization between Cope's gray tree frog and three other hybridization events with a couple of other species of frog. And as what often happens with hybrids, this frog species is 4N. It has extra chromosomes, so it is a tetraploid. So again, an abundant frog species in the province. It is freeze resistant. It is a species that is a result of a hybrid. No, it's not unisexual, John. So in this case, when this species was created, it's not unisexual. It still has sexual reproduction. And so it is its own separate species, but there are three origins, three hybrid events that resulted in the genetic sort of diversity that we have in this this species. But it's pretty cool that it has double the chromosomes of our typical frogs in the province. All right, and again, very common and abundant. And can you find them right outside your back door sometimes because they actually are attracted to lights. Of course, those lights attract insects. Wesley mentioned the tadpole tails become red under stress. Not just stress, Wesley, it's exposure to certain parasites, or sorry, certain predators. So when they're exposed to predation and the scent of nymphs from dragonflies, for example, their tails will change morphology, not only in terms of their color, but also in terms of their depth and width. And you'll also see that in response to larval salamander predatory cues. And so, yes, the tadpole morphology, the phenotype of the tadpole can change in response to exposure to certain types of predators, right? Because that prepares the tadpoles to be able to evade those predators more effectively. So some really amazing stuff. As I said, we could talk about one of these species for weeks on end and never really hit bottom in terms of all the amazing things that that we have learned about them, and of course all the things we still need to know. All right, so that's our gray tree frog. Turtles. Quickly looking on to our turtles. What species do we have in our images here? Musk in the bottom right. That is correct, Dermot. Musk turtle. Spotted on the top left. Yes. And then we have the painted in both of the other images. All right, Midland painted to be precise for these because these were taken in south central Ontario. All right, so those are painted turtles and spotted in the musk. There's all kinds of amazing things with turtles. And again, of these species, which one do you think I'm going to talk about based on what I've been doing so far? Remember, it's not just that's right. I'm going to go with the painted turtle. Whichever one has extra chromosomes. Good guess, Shelby. Nice. Well done. All right. I always like to get a chuckle there. All right, Amanda and Cooper, I'm going with painted. All right. But first, let's look and see what the painted turtle has in common with these other two species. So maybe we'd figure out what the other two species are. We have a young painted turtle here in its second year of life. We have snapping turtle. Yep. So there's snapping turtle and a map. That's right, map turtle. Just something of note, one of the things we often lament is invasive species, and we are concerned about them, but we also know that invasive species benefit some of our native species in some ways. The map turtle is an example. Populations of map turtles are doing pretty well because of an invasive species that they feed on. What invasive species do map turtles feed on? Painted turtles? No. Zebra mussels. Yeah. All right. So zebra mussels are incredibly abundant, and they are a favorite food of the map turtle because map turtles specialize on feeding on mussels. The gobies feed on the zebra mussels as well, but it's a good guess, Cooper, in terms of the map turtles feeding on them. But map turtles feed a lot on mollusks primarily. All right, so we have these three species. What do they have in common? And if you've taken the reptile biology and ID course that I teach, you would know this, or just have some background information. More research to protect map turtles. Wesley, yes. Yeah, John, eyes. Yes, they have eyes. I'm thinking about their ecology. What's something that they can do ecologically, as opposed to not so much about their appearance, but what about their ecology is connecting them. They all live in the water for sure. They all overwinter in the water. That is true as well. However, they don't always spend their first winter in the water. These three species can spend their first winter somewhere else Not in the mud, no. Overwinter in the nest, right? So yeah, overwintering, Amanda, in the nest. So they actually hatch out, but they stay in the nest. If it's late in the season and it's not warm enough for little hatchlings to get out of the nest, they'll actually overwinter in the nest, which means just like our frogs, these turtles are, and in this case, we say that they are freeze resistant. And so the studies that they have done have found that these turtles, when they are hatchlings, will produce glycols, glycerol, that will lower the freezing temperature of the fluids in their cells. And that'll reduce the probability of these turtles freezing. So these are freeze tolerant species as well. Looking at these images here, and I've got a highlight of claws. What do these long claws tell us? Oh, can you quickly go over the difference between tolerant and resistant? Yes, I can, Shelby. So resistant means that the animal doesn't freeze. So the cells in the animal's body, when it experiences temperatures below freezing, they do not freeze. Okay, so they're resisting, uh, resisting freezing. All right. Sorry, that should be do not freeze. Okay. Freeze tolerant, all right, means that they do freeze. So they can tolerate having some of their fluids frozen. Does that clear it up there for you, Shelby? Awesome. And Dermot says males have longer toes. Yeah, so if you look at the claws here, if you come across a painted turtle that has long claws, then that is a male painted turtle. Okay, so an example here of a freeze tolerant reptile. That's not a common thing. Most reptiles cannot tolerate freezing, but we have right here in Ontario, again, in some of our most common turtle species, the snapping turtle, the painted turtle, and the map turtle are all species that can overwinter. And if you're out and about in the early spring and you come across a tiny little hatchling turtle, that will probably be a turtle that is making its way to the water for the first time after spending its winter in a nest that is only a few centimeters below the surface. All right. Moving on to lizards and snakes. Let's identify our species here. So we should get this one already because we've seen this before, the fox snake down the bottom center. What are our other species? Hognose top left, that is correct. Gray rat snake at the right, yep, that's correct. We have a ringneck snake in the center, very good. How many of you have seen a ringneck snake before? Yeah, right. They're very secretive snake, tend to be mostly active at night. They love to eat redback salamanders, actually. So you typically find them in and around wooded areas where there are redback salamanders, and underneath, yeah, babies at Bark Lake, Jess. Yes, yeah, we found them there. Yeah, and five-line skink in the bottom left. Yeah, skink right here. Yep, very good. So we've identified them all. We can't quite see that five-line. All right. So those are our species. And the species I'm going to talk about is actually not pictured in any of these images, except for the lizard, of course. There's only one option with respect to the lizards. Thank you, Julian, for identifying that one just from looking at the tail. And of course, this is a newly hatched five-line skink that this photograph is of. They have the brightest blue tails at that time. So let's talk about the ubiquitous eastern garter snake. How many of you seen a garter snake before? I hope a lot of you have seen that. Yeah, very good. Awesome. So aside from being really active and curious, so if you know when you do see garter snakes, if again you pause for a moment to just watch them, um, and watch their behavior. They're quite interesting to watch. Now I'm looking at Dawson, who mentioned he just learned about Duck Island in Lake Ontario, and apparently they've got huge rat snakes and ring-necked snakes. So is Duck Island, is that somewhere, that must be over towards the mouth of St. Lawrence, right? So in Eastern Ontario, Dawson? Near Kingston, yeah. So our best and most abundant populations of gray rat snakes are over in Eastern Ontario, and they're considered to be a species that is threatened in that part of the province. So yeah, you can see some very large gray rat snakes in Eastern Ontario that are there. And of course, you can see ring-neck snakes and plenty of garter snakes. So some of the amazing things about this species, first of all, is the variety in color and pattern. In these images here, we just got sort of 3 different versions. And in terms of in Ontario, um, we have the melanistic form, which is all black. We have our typical, 3-stripe. We have them orange. We have them yellow. One of the things that I want you to think about with respect to Canada, not necessarily Ontario, but in Canada, we have the largest hibernacula used by snakes anywhere in the world. Where is that hibernacula? What is a hibernacula? Yeah, good question. Hibernacula. It is a place where the snakes hibernate over winter. And it's generally below the freezing or the frost line. And in some species, they will hibernate in large numbers, and other species that hibernate individually. And the garter snakes in Manitoba hibernate communally. And as I said, we have the largest communal hibernacula of snakes anywhere in the world. So within a day and a bit's drive, you can see one of the most amazing sights you could ever see with respect to snakes and their communal hibernation right here. Makes you think of Indiana Jones. Yes. So that's one really interesting thing about the eastern garter snake. First of all, is that we have these hibernacula. The other thing about them, again, we talked about their incredible diversity as far as their color goes. But I want to talk to you again. We've talked a lot about reproduction. Now, at these hibernacula, when they emerge, they end up with these big mating balls. And I'm not talking about, yeah, sorry, I have to be careful here about what I say. Mating ball is essentially, it's a ball of snakes, not not the testes of the snakes themselves, in case we're wondering there. All right, so the mating balls. And so there's typically in a mating ball, there'll be a female, like an elastic ball. Yeah. So there'll be a female and there'll be a whole whack of males. And all these males are trying to mate with this female. All right. Yeah, it'd be a pretty strange looking snake, wouldn't it be, Talia? All right. So we've got all these males all around this female. They're trying to mate with her. So what would be one strategy to be able to be the successful male that gets into the center of that mating ball and actually breeds with that female, contributes to the next generation? Wesley, you nailed it. Did you read this somewhere? All right. So yes. So some of these males smell like females. Nature documentaries are fantastic. All right, so some of the males smell like females. So then some of these males that are in the mating ball actually start to court the male that smells like a female, and he slips into the center and ends up breeding with the female. All right, so he's a little bit tricky there. All right, that's pretty cool stuff. Yes, there's all kinds of examples, Alexandra, and Talia, of these animals being very sneaky. And there's all kinds of tactics that animals use in order to be the one that fertilizes the offspring. However, we also know that the female actually can store sperm and have sperm from multiple males, which we're going to talk about next when we talk about the 5-line skink. Any questions about that? All right, so we're going to finish off with five-line skink here. It's gone a lot longer than I thought it would, but again, hopefully you're hanging in there, and thanks for all the questions and comments. So five-line skink in terms of identification here, we have in the top left, this is a young of year, so this is a newly hatched skink that hasn't gone through its first winter. This is a skink that is in its second summer, so it's approaching 1 year of age. And the one down here is a male that's approaching, 2.5 years of age. Dawson says, no rush. Last week we went 2 hours by the time questions were finished. Okay. All right. But I just want to be aware of the fact that this is exam week and people have work to do as well. So, but I'm glad again that folks are hanging in there. So this is just sort of giving an idea of what these animals look like. This one here is also approximately, this one's late summer. So this one is probably about 1.5 years old. All right, so these are our young five-line skinks still maintaining that blue tail. As they get older, of course, they change and they are sexually dimorphic. So sexual size dimorphism is something that we see in lots of reptiles. Right? For example, the map turtle, huge difference in the typical adult male map turtle versus the female. Do you know which one is bigger? John, how am I determining age? I'm determining age by the actual size of the skink. So it's hard to tell on these images with the size because they're all close-ups of the animal. But the young of year are going to be about 25 to 30 centimeters in length. The 1 year olds are going to be about 35 to 40. And we're going to in here around 40 to up to 60 millimeters, I should say, millimeters, not centimeters in length. And at this size here, they're at about 65 to 70 millimeters. All right, so I'm looking at the size. Okay, going back then, there lots of you I've seen here, Shelby, Vanessa, Connor, Spencer, and Cooper. Female is larger, and actually in many species, the females are larger. It's actually typically the case. However, in this species, the males are larger. If the males are larger, what does that often tell you about the ecology of the species? So here we see the male has a broader head. For example, it's wider than the neck. The head is generally longer relative to the body length than the female's head. Yes, there's competition. Now, there's always competition. But what about that competition has to be true in order for the males to be larger? Because it costs physical confrontation. Typically, there's often physical confrontation, or there is some sort of a preference that the females prefer larger males for other reasons. But quite often it means that there's some sort of physical competition between the males. And certainly, although these lizards are not territorial, during the breeding season, they do fight with each other. Okay, so we have broader heads, we have longer heads, and we have longer bodies and heavier bodies for the males compared to the females. That's one thing you can look at any time of year. You can look at the width of the head here. If it's an adult animal and the head is not thicker than the neck, then you're looking at a female. This coloration here that we're looking at, this is breed condition only. So later in the summer, we will not see this bright color on the cheeks and throat. All right, yes, and that's part of the sexual selection, right? Where the selective pressure is different for males and for females for whatever reason in terms of the preference of the female typically. So why are the females are larger? Because in turtles in particular, and lots of other animals, the size of the female is related to the number of eggs or the size of eggs or the size of offspring. Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, you're right, Shelby. That is correct. Females were larger. That is correct. All right, good. All right. So that's how we identify sex. Yes, there are a lot of skinks that have this color. When I was in South Africa, There's a skink there that looks exactly like the five-line skink as it's, when it's young and as it hatches and as it ages, but it's different. And actually all used to be considered to be in the same genus, but they split the New World or Western Hemisphere species from the Eastern Hemisphere. So yes, they're examples of skinks that look very much like our five lines throughout the world. And skinks actually, this family, the family Skinkidae, is actually, see if I can get that right. Family Skinkidae is the most species diverse family of lizards in the world. So they have the greatest number of species of any lizard in the world in the family Skinkidae. And the brightly colored tails in many lizards, blue is one of the most common colors. And I guess it seems to be a good color that helps to protect them from predators because it stands out. They've actually found that the blue color is also quite often associated with snake predation. I want to just talk again about some reproduction here. We talked about the garter snakes where the males have this mating ball and the female actually produces offspring within one brood. So one brood of young that she produces, I call it a brood because garter snakes give birth to live young. They're viviparous, so we don't call it a clutch. So the females will produce a brood with multiple fathers, and the same is true of five-line skinks. So a five-line skink, this female here is looking after her eggs, so that's pretty interesting as well, is that these lizards will look after their eggs, and females that look after their eggs have better success in terms of the hatching of those young than females who don't. But these eggs can actually, maybe I'll just change the color here, these eggs can have the DNA of multiple males. So rather than breeding with one female and one male, we have a situation where a male might breed with multiple females and a female might breed with multiple males. And that's something called polygynandry. All right, that's where both males and females have multiple partners. All right, and certainly it does not limit them as much, Alex, when they are breeding with multiple males. It helps to maintain that genetic diversity, and it helps, and this is not uncommon actually in nature. It's been documented now very frequently, not just in snakes and lizards, in turtles and in birds. They often have this pattern. Humans at college, yeah, sure. I'm not going to get in there, but as far as the conversation goes too far down that road, but absolutely post-secondary institutions and people not just at that age. It seems that throughout their life, this is something that happens. All right. So we could have, for example, this egg from male one, and this egg has genetic information from male one. This one has from male three, and this one male three, and maybe this one has male three as well. All right, so it's a way of hedging your bets genetically. Humans at retirement homes, sure, anywhere. Okay, so that sort of concludes the chat. And again, I wanted to highlight the fact that it is not just and that these things that are abundant and at our back door. How many of you have seen five-line skinks before? All right, a few people. Not too many. So the best place to find five-line skinks is along the southern edge of the Canadian Shield. So, about 45 minutes north of here, if you kind of go up through Cobeconk and, into Norland where you start hitting the Canadian Shield. If you're going to be in Gravenhurst, Connor, then go to the open rock barrens, all right, early in the spring. Bancroft area, yep, Muskoka. But you need the open sites in the early spring. Okay, and they'll generally be under rocks in those open sites. All right, so that's where you're going to find them. So you can just either sit there early in the morning and watch them run about, but you can also flip those rocks and look underneath. If you do happen to find one under the rock, make sure you move it out of the way and put the rock back down so that it don't crush it. If you're in the Muskoka region, be careful when you're flipping rocks because you do have Massasauga rattlesnakes as we get closer to Georgian Bay. Yeah, Talia, I hope it is going to be a great summer if you spend some time checking out these places. Okay, so Shelby has a question. Haven't studied reptiles and amphibians since we had our lectures in ecosystem skills. Biocommons has removed their mammal, reptile, amphibian ID tools from the website. Is there any way to get that information back so that we can keep on top of our ID skills? You can check in with the Biocommons folks. I'm just about to tell you about some courses that I offer. Because there aren't any courses offered at the college, Shelby, I have 3 courses that I offer to provide additional and more in-depth knowledge of the biology, ecology, and identification of amphibians and reptiles, and information about how to monitor and survey for them. So I'll talk about that in just a moment. Wesley, yes, we'll flip the rock so that the rock is actually closer to you and it's away from the body. Don't stick your fingers where you can't see them. As far as this, Vanessa, yes, I believe it is being recorded, so Adam will share that. And YouTube, yeah, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to just move on here if there's no questions about the skinks. I just wanted to again talk about why this is important for this knowledge. If you're in the environmental sector, we know habitat loss is an issue. This is a snapping turtle that didn't make it through the winter because of a loss of a beaver pond. And if we look at the habitats environments, if we look at this line right here, right, we look north of that line is green. This is the Canadian Shield. All right, this is the Shield country. And of course, we look at here and look at all the intensive use. So if we think about the habitat loss and intensive use, there's really a lot of pressure. And this is a map that I created that shows the number of degree days. So these are growing days. So 300, 250 to 200 and 100. And it shows the distribution of species at risk in the province. And of course, we can see that the greatest number of species at risk is also in the southern part of the province. And we have lots of species at risk that occur all the way up through into this area of about 150 degree days for these amphibians and reptiles. We can see how it drops off significantly once we reach 250 degree days. So lots of diversity down here, lots of species at risk. If you work in the environmental industry, knowing how to identify these animals and understanding their biology is something that will definitely help you in their careers. And if we look at the number of species in each of these areas, we have approximately 40 species here. We have 42 in this region. We have 40 here, 36, 30, and drops down to 22. That's species of amphibians and reptiles. So we can see again, if you want to find a lot of different species in one area, those of you mentioned Muskoka, pretty good spot. Those of you mentioned Kingston, we took it with gray rat snakes, pretty good area there to find a lot of different species, although some of those species are restricted to the Niagara Gorge and this area here. All right, so it's a little bit about the distribution of these species if you want to go out and find them. Other threats, of course, because of intensive use, you may have work as environmental graduates helping to mitigate the impact of roads and invasive species on these animals. We, of course, always have issues with animals being persecuted, being poached. We have issues with environmental pollution, and we have lots of emerging diseases as well and pathogens. So your work is certainly going to probably involve something with amphibians and reptiles. And Shelby mentioned your husband's a project manager for a civil construction company, and they managed a job on Highway 24. Yes, where they had to redesign the highway. Yeah, for Blanding's turtles. Yeah. Yeah, Blanding's turtles. I know folks that worked on that project in particular. And now again, we have these culverts and underpasses for a lot of different species. And this is something that is happening more and more. Yeah, James, yeah, between Brantford and Cambridge. Yeah. So yeah, very, very cool. And James is actually working on a project in his applied research project course. Hope you don't mind me sharing this, James. I'm looking at the efficacy of different underpasses and which ones are best suited for turtles, but also other species to reduce road mortality. So just as a little note, reptile biology identification, March 20th, that's a Saturday, where I'll be doing 3 live sessions to provide information about all of this ID and biology of these species. On March 27th, I will have an amphibian biology and identification session. and on May 17th, monitoring amphibians and reptiles. So these are live seminars, and they are offered. There's sort of 3 hour and 45-minute sessions distributed in one day. And then information is posted and available to you online. And Shelby, again, you mentioned having resources. So our resources that have recordings and modules that have questions that you can practice your ID and practice sort of demonstrating your knowledge. If you got a job interview, for example, you can go online once you've done these courses. You can access that information anytime. So if you're interested in those, you can look or contact me. The best way to get in touch with me is via email. I'll share the email address at the end. But one thing here, tropical field herpetology. Spencer, is there still a certificate? So there is no certificate offered in Ontario for any work with amphibians and reptiles. However, I have a letter that I will give you that will document you've taken all 3, and it outlines the fact that the material in my courses is consistent with and at par with the other course that's offered. There's only 2 courses offered in the province. One is the M&R course. Their focus is mostly on monitoring. My courses have the ID and the biology. So yes, I have a letter. If you, Spencer, we still had to finish the monitoring. Adam, so as far as the letter, again, it's a letter, but it's not a certificate. So again, there is no official certification, but the yeah, so the letter does provide that support and show that what you have gained is a value. And as I said, with my course, you have access to the information online anytime. So I don't expect you to remember everything. So you can go online and log in and check those resources. So I'll send you a message actually, Spencer, so that you have access to all those resources as well, because they have shifted location. Okay. Tropical field herpetology is another course that I offer. And if you've completed all 3 of the other courses, this happens in Costa Rica. And we have a biological station there. We don't know if it's going to happen this year or not. I haven't run it since 2019. Adam was with me on that experience, but I haven't been able to be down there since 2019. I'm hoping that by October we will be able to travel down there with the group. But I do have a waiting list already of people for that. However, it's something I want to make you aware of as well. So that ends our expedition for the evening. As far as what I wanted to share, you may have some questions going on. And you can contact me via email here. These courses, John, are not ecosystem management courses. These are actually my courses. They're not run through the college at all, because the college won't run them. And that's unfortunate. They used to be through the college, but changes with respect to contracts and agreements, the college couldn't run them. So I run them myself. So yes, you can email me at josh@destinationconservation.ca if you're interested in these courses. And then I can share some information with you about that. All right, not the school email, no, because these are run independently of the school. People who've graduated can take the courses as well, absolutely. But the reason that this is primarily intended for, as Adam said, for Fleming students, is that I've set the prices for all the courses at a pretty low cost. And again, that gives you access. And those costs, the reason there is a cost to it is 2 reasons. One, it costs me to have the infrastructure, the web hosting and all those tools to be able to make the information available to you. But I also, additional funds from that are used to continue to do research, but I also use it to fund interns. So when we go to Costa Rica, 3 people who went the previous year, who were assessed and evaluated by the trip leaders as well as their peers as the folks who performed the best in Costa Rica, they actually get to come back as interns and at no cost. And so I use the money from these courses to pay for those students to be able to come back to Costa Rica as interns. Thank you, Katrina. Glad you enjoyed it. So that's the courses, and as I said, they're priced to be student friendly. The monitoring course, for example, well, all the courses are $95, but the monitoring course for the amphibian and reptile course that's run by the folk, sort of the other independent course,